the last farewell. It was just another graveyard shift for Kelly at the gas station. Located at the edge of a desolate highway, the station rarely saw customers after midnight. Most of her time was spent restocking shelves, scrolling through her phone, or staring out at the dark horizon. At 2:13 a.m., an old sedan pulled up to Pump 3. The driver, an elderly man with sunken eyes, came inside, tipping his hat politely. "Fill it up, please," he said softly, handing her cash. She nodded and watched him shuffle back to his car. As Kelly stepped outside to pump the gas, she noticed the man sitting very still in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead. Something about his gaze made her uneasy. When the pump clicked, signaling the tank was full, she tapped on his window to let him know. The man didn't move. Kelly knocked again, harder this time, and still no response. Her heart began to race as she peered through the glass. He was gone. The car was empty. Kelly stumbled backward, her eyes darting around the empty lot. The only sound was the hum of the station lights. She ran back inside, locked the doors, and called her manager. The next morning, she learned the truth. A man matching the description of her customer had died in a car accident 5 miles from the gas station, 20 years ago to the day. The hospital's 4th floor. Jake was a security guard at a large hospital. His post for the night was the notoriously quiet 4th floor, which had been closed for renovations for years. Staff often joked it was haunted, but Jake didn't believe in that stuff. Around 3 a.m., he heard the elevator ding. Curious, he walked over and saw the doors slide open to reveal nothing. Just an empty elevator car. "Faulty wiring," he muttered, heading back to his chair. Minutes later, a faint tapping sound echoed down the hall. Jake grabbed his flashlight and followed the noise. It led him to room 413, where the tapping stopped. He pushed the door open. The room was empty, no furniture, no equipment, just bare walls. Then he saw it, faint, child-sized handprints smeared on the dusty window. A chill ran down his spine. As he backed out of the room, his radio crackled to life. A static-filled voice whispered, "Help us, please." Jake bolted downstairs and refused to return to the 4th floor. The next morning, he learned room 413 had been a pediatric ward, but it was abandoned after a fire claimed the lives of several children decades ago. The cleaning lady. Maria was a janitor at a downtown office building. Her job required her to work alone, scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans long after everyone else had gone home. One night, as she cleaned the 12th floor, she noticed a woman sitting in one of the cubicles, her back to Maria. This was unusual, employees never stayed this late. "Ma'am, the building is closed," Maria called out. The woman didn't respond. Annoyed, Maria walked closer. "Excuse me, you." The woman turned around abruptly, revealing a pale, sunken face with hollow eyes. Her mouth opened wide, unnaturally wide, as if to scream, but no sound came out. Maria dropped her mop and ran for the elevator. As she frantically pressed the button, she dared to look back. The woman was standing at the end of the hall, staring, her mouth still gaping. Maria quit the next day. When she shared her story, the supervisor paled. Years earlier, a former employee had jumped from the 12th floor window after hours. Her cubicle was the same one Maria had seen. The late-night radio caller. Alex worked the night shift at a small-town radio station. His job was to play music, read the news, and occasionally take calls from insomniac listeners. Most calls were harmless, until one night when a woman's voice crackled through the line. "Please," she whispered. "I need help." "Ma'am, what's wrong?" Alex asked, his voice steady despite the chill creeping over him. "He's coming for me. Please, I don't have much time," she said. "Where are you? I'll call the police." The line went dead. Shaken, Alex called the authorities and gave them the details. Hours later, he got a call back. The police traced the woman's phone to a house several miles away, but it had burned down earlier that night. The charred remains of a woman were found inside. Even more chilling? The fire had started hours before Alex got the call. The delivery driver's shortcut. Chris was a pizza delivery driver, used to working late nights. One evening, he got an order for a house on the outskirts of town, down a poorly lit dirt road. To save time, he decided to take a shortcut through the woods. The road was bumpy and dark, with trees crowding both sides. Halfway through, his headlights caught something on the road, a figure standing completely still. Chris slowed down, squinting to make out details. It was a woman in a tattered white dress, her hair obscuring her face. He rolled down his window slightly. "Hey, are you okay?" The woman's head jerked up, and Chris saw her face. It was gaunt, with empty, blackened sockets where her eyes should have been. Panicking, he hit the gas, speeding past her. When he glanced in the rearview mirror, she was gone. When Chris reached the customer's house, the man looked at him oddly. "You came through the woods?" the man asked. "People don't go that way anymore. Not since that woman died there, 10 years ago tonight." The warehouse shadow. Tom worked night shifts at a sprawling warehouse. The place was vast and eerily quiet after hours, the only sounds being the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional rattle of equipment. One night, as he organized boxes on a high shelf, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. A shadow darted across the far end of the aisle. "Hello?" Tom called out, his voice echoing. No response. Shrugging it off as his imagination, he continued working. Minutes later, a loud crash came from the other side of the warehouse. He sprinted over, finding a pallet of boxes toppled onto the floor. As he examined the mess, he felt it, a cold breath against his neck. Spinning around, he found himself face to face with nothing. Terrified, he reported the incident to his supervisor the next day. The supervisor frowned and muttered, "You're not the first to see something. People say the guy who died here in '98 never left." Tom didn't ask for details. He didn't stay on the job much longer, either. The library's ghost reader. Claire loved her job as the night librarian at the university. The solitude was comforting, and the only visitors were the occasional late-night student. One evening, as she reshelved books, she heard the faint rustling of pages. Odd, she was alone. Peeking around the corner, she saw a figure sitting at one of the study desks, back turned to her. They were reading an old, dusty book, flipping through the pages methodically. "Excuse me, the library's closing soon," Claire said. The figure didn't respond. Annoyed, she walked closer, reaching out to tap their shoulder. But her hand passed straight through them. The figure dissolved into a wisp of smoke, vanishing entirely. Claire later learned the book the figure had been reading hadn't been checked out in decades. It was part of a restricted collection locked away after a student allegedly went mad reading it. The night bus passenger Sam was a bus driver for the late-night route. His shift was uneventful most nights, with only a handful of passengers. One night, he pulled up to a stop in the middle of a quiet suburban street. A man in a dark coat boarded and sat in the back without saying a word. Sam thought nothing of it and continued driving. At the next stop, Sam glanced in the mirror. The man was gone. Confused, Sam stopped the bus and checked the rear seats. Empty. Shaking his head, he dismissed it as fatigue. But when he returned to his seat, he found something that made his blood run cold. A damp, muddy footprint on the driver's seat. The hotel room nobody left. Megan worked the front desk at a small hotel. Most guests were polite and uneventful, but room 214 was different. Late one evening, a man checked in, saying he was staying for the night. Megan handed him the key to room 214 and didn't see him again. The next morning, housekeeping reported the room was locked from the inside. No one answered their knocks, so Megan used the master key. The room was empty. The bed hadn't been slept in, the bathroom was dry, and the guests' belongings were gone. Yet the window was locked, and no one had passed the lobby during the night. Shaken, Megan checked the guest registry. The name he had written down didn't exist. Staff later revealed room 214 was infamous for strange occurrences. It was where a man had vanished years ago, leaving behind a suitcase and a mystery no one could solve. The cemetery call. Nina was a 911 dispatcher working the night shift. Most calls were routine: car accidents, disturbances, the occasional prank. But one call still haunts her. 911, "What's your emergency?" she asked. A faint, raspy voice replied, "I'm lost, in the dark." "Can you tell me where you are?" Nina asked, her fingers poised to type. "The cemetery, I can't find my way out." Chills ran down her spine. "Okay, stay on the line. Help is on the way. Can you see anything around you?" "The graves," the voice whispered. "They're everywhere, he's coming." "Who's coming?" Nina demanded, but the line went dead. Police searched the cemetery but found nothing, no signs of anyone lost, no phone, no footprints. When Nina reviewed the call log, her blood turned cold. The call came from a number that hadn't been in service for over 50 years. The factory apparition. Eddie worked nights at an old textile factory, monitoring machinery to ensure it ran smoothly. The building was a relic from the 1920s, with creaky floors and dim lighting that made it feel haunted even in daylight. One night, as Eddie patrolled the floor, he spotted a woman in a long dress standing near one of the machines. Her attire looked like something out of another era. "Ma'am, you're not allowed in here," Eddie called out. The woman didn't move. Instead, she slowly turned her head toward him, her face unnaturally pale and expressionless. Then, she walked straight into the machine, and disappeared. Eddie later learned that in the factory's early days, a woman had died in a gruesome accident with that very machine. Her ghost, they said, still roamed the floor, reliving her final moments. The parking garage lurker. Jen was a security guard at a multi-level parking garage. Her job was simple: patrol the area, keep an eye on the cameras, and ensure no one loitered after hours. Around 2 a.m., she noticed movement on one of the security monitors. A figure was pacing on the top floor, where no cars were parked. Jen headed up to investigate. When she arrived, the floor was empty. As she turned to leave, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. Spinning around, she saw nothing. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and her radio crackled. A voice whispered, "You're not supposed to be here." Jen sprinted back to the security office, where she reviewed the footage. The figure was still on the screen, but this time, it was standing right behind her. The cemetery groundskeeper. Mark was the night groundskeeper for a cemetery on the outskirts of town. Most of his shifts were quiet, spent walking among the graves with a flashlight or sitting in the caretaker's shed. One night, as he walked his usual route, he noticed something strange. A grave he knew was freshly filled earlier that day was now open, dirt scattered everywhere. Mark froze. Was this a prank? Animal activity? He shone his flashlight into the hole but saw nothing. As he stood there, a faint rustling came from behind him. Spinning around, he saw a figure standing among the tombstones, a pale, gaunt man in tattered clothing. "Hey!" Mark shouted. But the man didn't move. Then he smiled, a grotesque, impossibly wide grin, and lunged toward Mark. Mark ran faster than he ever had, locking himself in the shed until dawn. The next day, the grave was filled, perfectly undisturbed, and no one believed his story. But Mark noticed one thing that made his stomach drop: footprints in the dirt leading away from the grave, heading toward the caretaker's shed. The silent diner. Jenny worked the night shift at a 24-hour diner. Most nights, it was a mix of truckers and late-night travelers, but one particular shift left her questioning everything. At 3 a.m., a man walked in and sat at the counter. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his skin unnervingly pale. "What can I get you?" Jenny asked. The man didn't reply, just pointed at the coffee pot. She poured him a cup, and he nodded in thanks. Minutes passed. The man didn't drink his coffee or say a word. He just stared ahead, unblinking. Finally, Jenny said, "Sir, is everything okay?" He turned to her, opened his mouth to speak, and nothing came out. Instead, his face began to contort, his skin cracking like porcelain. Jenny screamed and ran to the back kitchen. When she returned with her co-worker, the diner was empty. The coffee cup sat untouched on the counter, stone cold. Later, she discovered the diner had a strange history. Decades earlier, a man matching that description had died of a heart attack in the very same seat. The late shift in the morgue. Eric worked as a technician in the hospital morgue, preparing bodies for autopsies. He was used to the eerie quiet and didn't scare easily. But one night, something happened that changed that. He was finishing paperwork when he heard a soft thud from one of the storage drawers. He froze. It happened again, louder this time. Eric stood up, walking toward the drawer where the sound originated. His hand trembled as he opened it. Inside was the body of a man who had been pronounced dead earlier that day. Eric sighed in relief, just his imagination. But as he closed the drawer, he heard it, a whisper. "Let me out." Eric ran out of the morgue, leaving everything behind. He quit the next day. When a colleague checked the drawer later, they found it empty. The body had been transferred hours before Eric heard the noise. The night watch at the abandoned mall. Ricky worked as a night guard at an old mall slated for demolition. It was a boring job, just walking the darkened halls and watching for trespassers. One night, as he patrolled the food court, he heard faint laughter. Children's laughter. "Hello?" he called out. His voice echoed, but no one answered. As he turned to leave, he saw something out of the corner of his eye, a child running past a storefront. "Hey, stop!" Ricky chased after the figure, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But when he reached the spot, there was no one there. Suddenly, all the mall's lights flickered on. The old arcade machines in the corner buzzed to life, their screens displaying static. Ricky bolted for the exit, but not before glancing back. In the reflection of a glass door, he saw them, a group of children staring at him, their faces blank and expressionless. The lonely cab ride. Mike was a taxi driver who often worked late-night shifts. One stormy evening, he picked up a woman standing alone on a deserted road. She wore a long coat and a scarf, her face hidden in the shadows. "Where to?" he asked. She handed him a slip of paper with an address written on it. He nodded and started driving. The journey was quiet, the only sound being the rain against the windshield. When Mike glanced in the rearview mirror, the woman seemed to vanish for a split second. Thinking it was a trick of the light, he shook it off. When he arrived at the address, he turned to let her know they were there, but the back seat was empty. Confused, Mike stepped out of the car and knocked on the door of the house. An elderly man answered. "I just dropped off a woman who gave me this address," Mike explained. The man's face went pale. "That's impossible," he whispered. "My wife died on this road 10 years ago, and you're the third driver to say this." The factory clock. Linda was the only worker in an old clock factory, tasked with maintenance during the night shift. The building was filled with ticking clocks, creating an unsettling symphony of noise. At midnight, all the clocks stopped simultaneously. Linda froze. This had never happened before. Suddenly, she heard footsteps echoing through the factory. "Hello?" she called out. No response. As she walked toward the source of the noise, she noticed something horrifying. Every clock face now displayed the same time, 3:33 a.m. A whisper came from behind her, "Your time is up." Terrified, Linda turned around, but no one was there. She ran out of the factory, refusing to ever return. Later, she discovered the factory owner had died at 3:33 a.m. exactly 1 year earlier. The delivery driver's shortcut. Chris was a pizza delivery driver, used to working late nights. One evening, he got an order for a house on the outskirts of town, down a poorly lit dirt road. To save time, he decided to take a shortcut through the woods. The road was bumpy and dark, with trees crowding both sides. Halfway through, his headlights caught something on the road, a figure standing completely still. Chris slowed down, squinting to make out details. It was a woman in a tattered white dress, her hair obscuring her face. He rolled down his window slightly. "Hey, are you okay?" The woman's head jerked up, and Chris saw her face. It was gaunt, with empty, blackened sockets where her eyes should have been. Panicking, he hit the gas, speeding past her. When he glanced in the rearview mirror, she was gone. When Chris reached the customer's house, the man looked at him oddly. "You came through the woods?" the man asked. "People don't go that way anymore. Not since that woman died there, 10 years ago tonight." The warehouse shadow. Tom worked night shifts at a sprawling warehouse. The place was vast and eerily quiet after hours, the only sounds being the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional rattle of equipment. One night, as he organized boxes on a high shelf, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. A shadow darted across the far end of the aisle. "Hello?" Tom called out, his voice echoing. No response. Shrugging it off as his imagination, he continued working. Minutes later, a loud crash came from the other side of the warehouse. He sprinted over, finding a pallet of boxes toppled onto the floor. As he examined the mess, he felt it, a cold breath against his neck. Spinning around, he found himself face to face with nothing. Terrified, he reported the incident to his supervisor the next day. The supervisor frowned and muttered, "You're not the first to see something. People say the guy who died here in '98 never left." Tom didn't ask for details. He didn't stay on the job much longer, either. The library's ghost reader. Claire loved her job as the night librarian at the university. The solitude was comforting, and the only visitors were the occasional late-night student. One evening, as she reshelved books, she heard the faint rustling of pages. Odd, she was alone. Peeking around the corner, she saw a figure sitting at one of the study desks, back turned to her. They were reading an old, dusty book, flipping through the pages methodically. "Excuse me, the library's closing soon," Claire said. The figure didn't respond. Annoyed, she walked closer, reaching out to tap their shoulder. But her hand passed straight through them. The figure dissolved into a wisp of smoke, vanishing entirely. Claire later learned the book the figure had been reading hadn't been checked out in decades. It was part of a restricted collection locked away after a student allegedly went mad reading it.